Some houses do not scream their secrets. They whisper them through locked doors, sealed walls, and rooms no one is meant to enter again. In the early 1900s, silence was often mistaken for dignity, and grief was hidden behind lace curtains and polite smiles. But sometimes grief curdles into obsession. Sometimes a single room becomes a tomb for truth. And sometimes, when that room is finally opened, history exhales something it tried to bury forever. The death of Mr. Ashcroft did not arrive with drama or spectacle, at least not on the surface. It was announced the way most tragedies were in small Missouri towns at the turn of the 20th century, through hushed conversations, black armbands, and the slow toll of a church bell that everyone recognized by sound alone. He was found in his bed one winter morning, the official cause recorded as heart failure, sudden but not unheard of for a man of his age. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no obvious wounds. The doctor signed the certificate, the undertaker prepared the body, and the town accepted the explanation with the quiet resignation reserved for deaths that seemed inconvenient rather than suspicious. What unsettled people was not how quickly he died, but how quickly his wife disappeared afterward. Eleanor Ashcroft had been a visible presence before that day. She attended Sunday services without fail, hosted modest afternoon teas, and was known for walking the perimeter of her property each evening just before dusk. After the funeral, she was seen only once more in public, standing stiffly beside the fresh grave as soil thudded onto the coffin below. Her face showed no tears, no collapse, only a fixed stillness that unsettled those who tried to read it. When the ceremony ended, she did not linger. She returned home alone, closed the door, and for weeks afterward, no one saw her come out again. In the days immediately following the burial, townspeople expected the usual signs of mourning. Curtains drawn, visitors arriving with casseroles and condolences, perhaps a distant relative coming to stay. Instead, the Ashcroft house grew unnervingly quiet. The front windows remained dark even during the day. Letters went unanswered. When a church deacon attempted to check on her, he was told through the door that she required no assistance. Her voice, witnesses later said, sounded calm, controlled, almost rehearsed. Rumors began, as they always did, softly and indirectly. Some said she had been a cold wife even before her husband's death, more dutiful than affectionate. Others recalled arguments overheard through open windows late at night, though no one could repeat the words spoken. A few whispered that Mr. Ashcroft had not been well for months, that he had grown thinner, paler, as if something were draining him. None of it amounted to proof, but in a town where life followed predictable rhythms, the absence of normal grief felt wrong. Within a week, the widow took the first action that would forever mark her as an object of unease. She sent for carpenters, not neighbors or relatives, but men from outside the town. They arrived early one morning, unloaded planks, nails, and iron fittings, and were instructed to go directly upstairs. They worked for hours behind closed doors. No one was allowed to observe. When they finished, they left without speaking to anyone, carrying no furniture back down, only empty crates and unused tools. By evening, one of the upstairs windows had been boarded from the inside, and a heavy new lock had been installed on a door that had once stood open during gatherings. People asked questions. Eleanor Ashcroft answered none of them. She resumed no social duties. She refused offers of companionship. The house became a boundary she did not cross, and the sealed room became something she would not acknowledge. To the town, it felt as if her grief had not merely isolated her, but hollowed her out, leaving behind a woman who existed only to guard something unseen. As months passed, the official memory of Mr. Ashcroft began to blur. He became less a person and more an absence, a gap that his widow seemed determined to preserve rather than heal. The strange thing was not that she mourned alone, but that her solitude appeared deliberate, disciplined, almost ritualistic. Every action she took after his death suggested control, not collapse. She paid bills on time, the garden remained trimmed, the house exterior was immaculate, yet no laughter, no music, no visitors ever crossed the threshold again. Some believed her withdrawal was an act of devotion, that she was honoring her husband by turning inward, clinging to privacy in a world that demanded spectacle from grief. Others felt something darker had settled over the house, something that fed on silence and obedience. The idea that a woman could seal herself off so completely unsettled people more than any ghost story could. It challenged their belief that sorrow softened people, that loss made them fragile and visible. Instead, Eleanor Ashcroft became opaque. The death that should have unraveled her seemed to harden her resolve. She lived as though the outside world had ceased to exist the moment her husband's heart stopped beating, as though everything that mattered now lay behind locked doors and closed rooms, waiting to be preserved exactly as it had been on the day he died. The upstairs room had once been the brightest space in the Ashcroft house, a corner chamber with two tall windows that caught the morning sun and spilled it across pale wallpaper and polished floorboards. Before the death of Mr. Ashcroft, it had been used occasionally for guests, sometimes for storage, sometimes simply left open to air, its door rarely closed and never locked. Children who had visited the house years earlier remembered standing in that doorway looking out at the road below, never imagining that the same room would one day become the most forbidden place in the entire town. The change came abruptly and without explanation. Within days of the funeral, Eleanor Ashcroft instructed the hired carpenters to empty the room completely. Every piece of furniture was removed, not discarded, but carried downstairs and placed carefully in the cellar as though it still held value. Curtains were taken down, rugs rolled up, picture hooks pulled from the walls. When the men asked what was to replace them, she answered only that nothing was to remain. By the end of the first day, the room stood stripped and echoing, its bare boards creaking under each footstep. Then came the ceiling. Heavy planks were fitted over one of the windows from the inside, fixed so tightly that no light could pass through. The second window was shuttered and locked, the glass still visible but unreachable. A new door was installed, thicker than the original, reinforced with iron brackets that looked excessive for any ordinary room. The lock was of a kind usually reserved for storehouses, not private homes. When the final bolt was set, Eleanor tested it herself, turning the key slowly, listening to the mechanism engage, her expression unreadable. From that day forward, the upstairs hallway ended at that door. She instructed anyone who entered the house, which was rare, never to approach it. Servants who lasted more than a few weeks learned quickly that even mentioning the room would result in dismissal. One young maid later claimed she was told that if she ever heard sounds from behind the door, she was to leave the house immediately and not return. Another said the widow insisted the room no longer existed, that it was a mistake in the house's layout, something people remembered incorrectly. Despite these warnings, the room made itself known. During the summer months, when heat pressed down on the house and forced windows open, a smell began to drift through the upper floor. It was faint at first, sharp and metallic, easily dismissed as old pipes or spoiled food. As weeks passed, it grew heavier, lingering in the hallway no matter how much it was scrubbed or aired. Eleanor responded by keeping the upstairs closed off entirely, sealing vents, blocking drafts, and spending most of her time on the lower floors. At night, neighbors claimed the house sounded different than it once had. Not louder, but restless. Footsteps were reported overhead long after the widow had extinguished her lamps. Some swore they heard a dull, thudding noise, rhythmic and slow, as if something were being moved repeatedly against a wall. Others described a low humming that carried through open windows on still evenings, a sound that could not be traced to any instrument or machinery known at the time. When confronted with these accounts, Eleanor Ashcroft denied them calmly, suggesting that grief made people imagine things. What disturbed the town most was her consistency. She never altered her story. The room was private. It was sealed for a reason. It would not be opened. Years passed, and the door remained untouched, gathering dust. Its lock never changed. Its key always kept on her person. Even when minor repairs were made to the house, workers were instructed to avoid that section of the upper floor entirely, and they complied, unwilling to test her resolve. As the house aged, the sealed room seemed untouched by time. While paint peeled elsewhere and floorboards warped with humidity, the door remained solid, its iron fittings free of rust, maintained with care. Eleanor polished the handle regularly, as though the barrier itself mattered more than what lay beyond it. To some, it appeared she was guarding a shrine. To others, a prison. No one could agree on what the room contained, only that its existence had reshaped the house around it, turning an ordinary home into a place defined by what could not be seen. Children dared each other to sneak inside, though none ever succeeded. Adults lowered their voices when passing the house, instinctively glancing toward the upstairs windows, even though they knew one had been blinded and the other locked. The room became a presence rather than a place, an unseen weight pressing down on the household and the town alike, fed by silence, strengthened by refusal, and made more powerful with every year it remained sealed. As the years passed, the sealed room stopped being a curiosity and became a source of unease that threaded itself quietly through the town's daily life. People no longer spoke of it openly, but it lingered in conversations the way a bad memory does, never fully gone. Children grew up hearing fragments of stories from older siblings or overheard whispers at the dinner table, and by the time they were old enough to understand fear, the Ashcroft house had already claimed a permanent place in their imagination. It was not described as haunted, at least not at first, but as wrong, a place where something had been interrupted and never allowed to finish. The first rumors centered on sound. Neighbors living closest to the property claimed that on certain nights, usually when the air was heavy and still, the house produced noises that could not be explained by age or weather. Slow footsteps were said to move across the upper floor long after Eleanor Ashcroft had retired for the night. The steps were deliberate, measured, pacing back and forth in a way that suggested intention rather than accident. Some nights, the pacing stopped abruptly, replaced by a dull scrape, as though something heavy were being dragged a short distance and then set down again. Others spoke of tapping sounds that came from behind the boarded window, irregular but persistent, like knuckles against wood or fingernails testing the strength of a barrier. These accounts were often dismissed as imagination, yet they followed a pattern too consistent to ignore. The sounds were almost always reported between midnight and the early hours of the morning, and almost always ceased when someone approached the house directly, as if whatever caused them reacted to attention. Smell was the second rumor, and the one that unsettled people most deeply. During late summer, when heat magnified every odor, a sharp scent was said to drift from the upper floor, seeping out through cracks in the structure and lingering in the air around the house. It was described in different ways by different people, metallic, sour, sweet in a way that turned the stomach. Eleanor Ashcroft responded by keeping windows shut even in oppressive heat, choosing suffocation over exposure. When questioned, she blamed old plumbing or spoiled food, explanations that satisfied no one but could not be disproven. Those who worked briefly inside the house provided the most disturbing accounts. A handyman once claimed that while repairing a stair railing, he felt a sudden drop in temperature near the sealed door, as though cold air were leaking through solid wood. Another said he heard breathing on the other side, faint but unmistakable, timed with his own movements, stopping whenever he froze in place. Both men refused to return, even when offered additional pay. Eleanor did not argue with them. She simply found replacements, as if expecting such departures. The widow herself became part of the rumor. People began to note how often she stood outside the sealed room, key in hand, listening. She was seen ascending the stairs at odd hours, sometimes late at night, sometimes just before dawn, carrying trays that returned empty. No one could say what she did behind that door, only that she remained there for long stretches of time, unmoving, as if waiting for something. When she descended, her face was composed, her clothing neat, giving no indication of distress or exertion. As the town's population changed and new families moved in, the stories evolved. Some believed the room contained the preserved remains of her husband, hidden away in defiance of burial customs. Others whispered that he had not died naturally at all, that something had gone wrong between them, something that could not be undone. There were darker theories too, involving madness, punishment, or an attempt to reverse death itself. No version was ever confirmed, but each retelling added another layer of dread. What made the rumors endure was Eleanor's absolute refusal to address them. She never threatened legal action, never lashed out in anger, never attempted to defend her reputation. Her silence acted as confirmation in the minds of many, as though acknowledging the rumors would weaken whatever fragile control she maintained. The house seemed to mirror her restraint, holding itself together through sheer will, resisting decay in the one place that mattered most. By the time Eleanor Ashcroft grew old and frail, the sealed room had outlived its original mystery and become something larger, a symbol of the town's collective fear of what happens when grief is locked away instead of released. People avoided walking past the house after dark. Parents warned children not to point at the upstairs windows. Even skeptics felt a tightening in their chest when passing beneath the shadow of the boarded frame, as though the house itself were aware of being watched, guarding its secret with the same quiet determination as the woman who refused to let it go. As Eleanor Ashcroft entered the final years of her life, the routines she had built around the sealed room did not weaken, but grew more rigid, as though time itself threatened to undo what she had worked so carefully to preserve. Her hair turned silver, her posture stooped, and her steps slowed, yet she continued to climb the stairs every day, gripping the banister with one hand and the small iron key with the other. Neighbors noticed that even when illness confined her indoors for weeks, the upstairs light was never neglected, glowing faintly behind the shuttered window at hours when most of the house remained dark. She spoke little of her past and never of her husband, but those who interacted with her in her old age described a woman consumed not by confusion, but by purpose. Her mind remained sharp, her instructions precise. Groceries were ordered with exact quantities, bills paid promptly, and the house maintained with almost ceremonial care. Yet all of this discipline seemed secondary to one unbreakable rule: the room upstairs must remain untouched. When a distant cousin wrote suggesting that she sell the house and move somewhere more manageable, Eleanor responded with a single sentence stating that she would leave only when she was carried out. As her health declined, members of the church attempted to intervene. They urged her to allow someone to stay with her, citing concerns about falls or sudden illness. She refused each offer calmly, assuring them she was not alone. When pressed to explain, she changed the subject or ended the conversation entirely. Some left those visits shaken, unsure whether she meant she felt spiritually accompanied or whether she was referring to something far more literal within the house. In her final months, her behavior grew more unsettling. She began spending longer periods near the sealed door, sometimes sitting in a chair positioned directly in front of it, key resting in her lap. Servants who checked in occasionally reported hearing her speaking softly, not loudly enough to distinguish words, but clearly addressing someone. When questioned, she claimed she was reading scripture aloud, though no book was ever seen in her hands. The cadence of her voice, witnesses said, sounded more like conversation than prayer. Despite her frailty, she maintained control over the house until the end. When a physician suggested opening windows upstairs to improve air circulation, Eleanor refused with a firmness that startled him. She insisted that the air in the house was exactly as it should be. On one occasion, when a floorboard near the sealed room creaked loose, she demanded it be repaired immediately, watching the worker closely until the final nail was driven, her eyes never leaving the door. Her death came quietly, without the drama that had followed her husband's. One morning, the milk left on her porch went untouched. By evening, concern prompted a visit from the sheriff and a neighbor. They found her in her bed, hands folded neatly at her sides, the key to the sealed room clutched tightly in her fingers. Her face bore no sign of fear or struggle, only an expression of relief that some interpreted as satisfaction. The question of the room arose almost immediately. With no direct heirs living nearby, the house fell under the care of local authorities. Before any inventory could be taken, the sheriff removed the key from her hand and attempted to open the door. It resisted at first, the lock stiff from years of limited use. When it finally turned, the sound echoed through the hallway, sharp and final, as though something had been broken rather than opened. Those present hesitated. Even men who dismissed the rumors felt an instinctive dread standing before the door. It had become more than wood and iron. It was a boundary reinforced by decades of fear, silence, and speculation. The sheriff ordered the door opened, but no one volunteered to turn the handle. Eventually, he did it himself, pushing the door inward slowly, the hinges groaning in protest after so many years of stillness. What lay beyond would soon be documented, discussed, and dissected by officials and townspeople alike. But in that first moment, before words could form, there was only shock. The room Eleanor Ashcroft had guarded so fiercely was revealed not as a forgotten storage space or a place of dust and decay, but as something carefully maintained, deliberately preserved, frozen in time as if waiting for the exact moment she could no longer protect it. When the door opened fully, the first thing that struck those standing in the hallway was not what they saw, but what they felt. The air inside the room was colder than the rest of the house, unnaturally so, as if sunlight and warmth had been deliberately excluded for decades. A faint, stagnant smell lingered, not the stench of rot many had feared, but something older, dry and metallic, like dust mixed with old coins and extinguished candles. The sheriff stepped inside first, his boots leaving marks on a floor that was otherwise spotless. The room had not been abandoned, it had been preserved. The walls were freshly painted, far newer than the rest of the house and free of cracks or peeling. The floorboards gleamed with oil, polished regularly. At the center of the room stood a narrow bed, carefully made, its sheets yellowed with age but neatly tucked, as though awaiting an occupant who might return at any moment. A small table stood beside it, holding a water pitcher, an empty glass, and a folded cloth arranged with deliberate care. Along one wall stood a tall mirror, its surface darkened with age, but still reflective enough to catch the movement of those inside the room. Facing it was a wooden chair, worn smooth at the arms, positioned precisely, as if someone had spent countless hours sitting there, watching. On the opposite wall hung a calendar, its pages yellowed and brittle, frozen on a date from the year of Mr. Ashcroft's death. Each day leading up to that date had been marked with a small, careful pencil line. No days beyond it were touched. As officials continued to examine the space, they began to notice details that made their unease deepen. Beneath the bed, they found personal items arranged in rows, a man's shoes, polished and intact, a comb, a pocket watch that no longer ticked but had been wound repeatedly until its mechanism failed. On the bedside table lay a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, all written in the same hand, all addressed to the same man, none bearing a response. Then there was the far corner of the room, partially hidden behind a folding screen. When it was moved aside, the truth that Eleanor Ashcroft had protected for so long finally took shape. A human form lay there, not concealed, not buried, but positioned carefully, dressed in preserved clothing, limbs arranged with intention. Time had stripped it of softness, leaving behind a rigid reminder of mortality, skin drawn tight, features unmistakable. Mr. Ashcroft had never truly left the house. There were no signs of violence on the remains, no visible wounds that could explain death beyond what had already been recorded. What disturbed observers was not how he died, but what had happened afterward. His body had been treated, cleaned, maintained, tended to, with an intimacy that crossed from devotion into fixation. Chemical preservatives had been used sparingly, just enough to slow decay. His clothing had been changed over the years, carefully mended, replaced when worn. Someone had been caring for him long after burial should have ended that responsibility. The realization settled slowly, heavy, and inescapable. Eleanor Ashcroft had not sealed the room to hide a crime, but to continue a life that no longer existed. She had created a space where time stopped, where death was acknowledged, but not accepted. The bed, the chair, the calendar, all of it formed a routine, frozen in place. She had eaten meals downstairs and brought portions back up. She had spoken into the silence and received no answer, yet returned again and again, sustaining a bond that the outside world believed had ended. Officials documented everything, though many found their hands trembling as they wrote. The house was no longer a curiosity but a testament to what grief could become when left alone and unchallenged. The widow's refusal to explain herself now felt less like secrecy and more like protection, as if she had believed that understanding would destroy the fragile balance she maintained. Word spread quickly, as it always does, but no version of the story fully captured what it felt like to stand in that room. Photographs were taken, reports filed, arrangements made to remove what had been found. Yet even as procedures began, those present sensed that something essential would be lost once the room was emptied, as though the space itself carried the weight of Eleanor's long vigil. When the body was finally prepared for proper burial, the mirror reflected the room one last time, emptying of its purpose, the chair still facing where someone had once sat for hours, the calendar still marking a day that never ended, and the door standing open for the first time in decades, exposing a silence that no lock could restore, a silence thick enough to feel, heavy enough to press against the chest, lingering long after everyone stepped back into the hallway and left the room behind, unchanged in structure, yet forever altered, holding the shape of a devotion that refused to die and a love that remained sealed in place even when there was no one left to guard it. only the echo of footsteps that had paced the floor for years and the faint impression that something still waited in the corner just out of sight.